Hi, my name is Collin Krakowiecki. I'm a senior finance major, and for my submission for Celebration of Scholarship, I'll be presenting on my current progress for my honors capstone project. Just a little bit of the disclosure as we get started here. This presentation is based on a work in progress. I've been working on my honors capstone project for several months now, but it's not quite complete. I'll be presenting on my final works in May at the end of the semester, but I wanted to use this opportunity to be able to present what I've been working on, some of the results that I've come up with so far, and to provide a little bit of a roadmap on where I'm going next with my project. So the purpose of my honors capstone project primarily will be to evaluate the environmental impact of Millikin's residential facilities. I've been taking a look at some different environmental impacts of our different buildings, namely water, electrical use, natural gas, and sewage, and then to compare those numbers to other similar buildings across the United States, kind of evaluate the benchmark, see how Millikin is doing in comparison, and then lastly, to hopefully provide some investment recommendations to the university on ways that we could improve ourselves going forward. So some of the initial roadblocks that I ran into as I started on my research phase of my project was inconsistent data. That was kind of a big one. Not all of our buildings had individualized data for all of the different fields I was looking for. You might have some buildings that I could get accurate electrical readouts on each individual building, whereas others it would be a grouped meter, so I might have the electrical output for a building, but it might also include in those numbers the electrical outputs for, say, Schilling Hall. So that kind of ran into some issues with those. Not all of our buildings did the same thing. Some of our buildings operate on a boiler system to do their heating, others use natural gas, so I wasn't getting all of the same metrics for all the different buildings, and that was just making it a little bit difficult to kind of compare my different categories. And another one, obviously, that's been an issue for a lot of things these days, COVID kind of threw off my data a little bit as well, because we had the ability at the end of the 2020 school year for students to leave the residence halls early during the course of the semester. So the output data for like the February, March, April months at the end of the 2020 school year look different than we would typically expect from a standard residential operating year. Some of the solutions that I found for my initial problems, I do have two buildings that I found that gave me accurate data and that was suitable for all of the different categories I was hoping to get. I have individual data on all of water, electricity, natural gas, and sewage for both Weck Hall and New Hall 4. Those are in the new halls directly across from Schilling Hall. The nice thing about those also is that we have a way of standardizing the usage rates. I went ahead and got data from the Office of Campus Life that gave me the rates of students that were living in the halls at any given time. So even in the periods where we had students that went home early and maybe had less students living in the hall during those COVID months, I can still take the different usage rates and standardize those out on a by student basis so that we can still accurately compare times when the building is full to when it's partially empty. So next, I'd like to go into some of the current results from my research. First up, we have water usage. As you can see, these graphs are pretty similar. We got Weck Hall up on the top there, and then New Hall 4 on the bottom. I'm not 100% sure what I've got here with the spike in the data in the middle of the year. Maybe somebody left their shower on for a couple days at a time, but for the most part, you see those graphs kind of acting very similarly. A couple things that are pretty easy to spot here as you look in. We've got the summer breaks here, so some of those peaks where there's essentially no water usage in the buildings while students are at home. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, we have the students that left early to go home for COVID and take virtual semesters, so you see the steep declines there where there wasn't as much water usage at the end of those semesters. Up next, we have the energy usage. Something that's interesting to note about these is there's a little bit of an inverse relationship. And again, Weck Hall on the top and New Hall 4 on the bottom. You definitely see a very similar pattern on these two, hardly any discrepancy between the two graphs. Weck Hall and New Hall 4 have the essentially exact same amount of students that live there as well as their square footage, so we see really similar things. But I like to point out the inverse relationship between the natural gas usage we have here in red and then the electrical usage in the buildings here in blue. In both Weck and New Hall 4, they use natural gas for the heating of the buildings, but the AC is actually run on air conditioning. So in our hotter months here in July and all the way up through the fall, you see the electrical being used a lot more than the natural gas, and then here in kind of our winter months, December through February or so, you see a lot more electrical usage. Something that's interesting to point out, these two peaks right here. I don't know if anybody remembers the polar vortex from 2019. I know campus operations were down for a couple days, and it was wind chills below -40 and things like that. So definitely people using a lot more heat around that time. It kind of stood out on the graph for both buildings during that time period. So some data according to the EPA. I was able to take our buildings and put the data from our different outputs onto EPA metrics, and using the exact same method they use to determine Energy Star ratings. That's kind of one of the most commonly accepted stamps of energy efficiency, and you'll see that on a lot of different household appliances, on like your washers and dryers and fridges and things like that, but also it's a commercial business rating. So they will use that to kind of measure the overall environmental impact of different commercial use buildings, and then kind of compare those against the EPA standards and where they think different buildings should be at. This is a very standardized process. It basically just takes the kilowatt hours of electrical output divided by square footage. So you can compare a smaller building like our small residence hall designed to hold 50 people all the way up against like really large like hotels and things like that, because it's based on like how much energy is being used per square foot of a given building. Currently, WEC Hall appears to be operating about 22.5% more efficiently than buildings that are on the EPA median, which is really nice. And then New Hall 4, really similar, about 23%. Those numbers don't vary too much, like I said. All the graphs very similar, kind of their outputs are right in that same range, so it's not surprising that they're in the same vein. But I do want to note out here that not all of this data is like 100% certified. I'm still waiting on getting really accurate square footage ratings for the different buildings. I used kind of the best tools I could to get as close as possible, but even if this is like a rough estimate, the numbers are still looking pretty good for our buildings. So some things going forward with my project. First and foremost, I want to add sewage data. It took me a long time to really get all of the different output numbers input into the EPA website to be able to develop the different graphs and kind of see where we were at. So my next big task is transporting all of the manual and raw sewage data that I have into the systems that I've already done with the other 3 types of information. And then I would like to compare the per student rates going back several years. I have about 3 years of data for all of our different sources here, and I think it would be nice to kind of see where the different buildings compare to really see how much of an impact the recent months and the COVID year have had, and kind of what our rates look like on a year-to-year basis. And then also finally adding my investment recommendation. A couple ideas that I've already had would be adding some more solar units on campus to be able to cut down on the amount of electricity we're purchasing off the grid. And then also maybe getting some like better insulated windows that might be able to help with like heating and cooling costs in the buildings. But I haven't done enough like deep down research to decide what those different projects will be, but those are just kind of some of my initial thoughts. Thank you all for taking the time to take a look at my research and my progress so far. In lieu of being able to have an audience that can like pitch me questions and things like that, I would like to take the opportunity to get some feedback. Like I said, this is a work in progress, so anything that anybody could give me to kind of help refine my progress or maybe get me in a better spot before I finish this up here next month, I would really appreciate it. I've thrown my email address down on the screen, so if you have any feedback or comments or anything you think could help me out, I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much.